Welcome all to the colloquium. I have the pleasure to invite Professor Robert Lamberts from South Africa. He is a professor in exercise physiology related to Stellenbosch University. He was invited to shake hands with the Dutch king, who was in South Africa last week, but unfortunately he preferred to be here over shaking hands to the king. Jos de Koning compensated that a little bit. Our king shake hands with Robert Lamberts. But I'm very glad that he's here and he will present on cycling. Robert, I'm very glad that you're here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hein. So thanks, first of all, for the invite. Hein, Jos, we collaborate a lot together, so it's great. Today my talk will be around finding the balance in cycling. Let's see if this is going to work today. And I'll be speaking very much in an applied way. So yes, science, but very applied as well. So hopefully we can learn a little bit as well. I understand there's a few people from Defensie also online, so welcome to those people as well. And as part of that, actually, I'll be speaking about different components. I'll give a little bit of background where I'm from. Yes, I speak in English, but I'm originally Dutch, moved to South Africa a long time ago. And then talk a little bit about submaximal and maximal performance testing with regards to training and overtraining and how can we spot that and what are the markers for that. Then I'll show you some field data and what is the latest development in field data, especially within cycling, but I think it relates to a lot of endurance sports and it's being transferred to a lot of endurance sports as well. And then I'll give you some of the data that we're busy preparing for submission at the moment about a male and a female Grand Tour winner. So I was born and raised in the Netherlands. I did my human movement sciences in Groningen quite a while back on that side, and then moved out to Cape Town as part of a master's project in 2005. I do quite a bit of sports research, a little bit of clinical research, mainly related to cerebral palsy, but the main chunk I do actually in sports research. From there, I moved to Stellenbosch University. We've got three big universities in and around Cape Town, where I worked within orthopedic surgery, so very much clinical work again, and then more lately in Institute of Sport and Exercise Medicine. They mainly work with sports physicians, sports doctors, and then I'm currently based within movement science and exercise therapy. My background, I've got lots of roles, but as further you climb up the ladder, the closer you get to a full professorship, the more administrative tasks you get. Not always the fun part, but that's what comes with it. So I'm actually the head of the division within my division. So I look after all the master and PhDs, not all as a supervisor, but all the administrative around that. I the departmental rep as well for the doctoral committee, and I sit on different committees, including the faculty senate and ethics as well. Main areas where you research in is in performance monitoring, mainly in endurance sports, cycling specifically, a big interest in that specific side as well. And then more recently, what a very popular component is at the moment is fatigue accumulation and fatigue resistance and recovery. How does that specifically work? In addition to that, I fulfill a few different roles outside of that. If you're not busy enough as an academic, I do some presentations and some lecturing work for UCI. I'm an associate editor, actually through Jos at IGSPP, and then I fill a role as well with ECSS, which is the European College of Sports Science, where I sit on the scientific board. So let's go talk a little bit about training and principles around that. So very basically, bringing it back because I don't know all your backgrounds. We talk about training and training load. We're talking about training load on the one side and recovery on the other. And we need to make sure that that balance stays in place, at least for most of the time, because if they've got a disbalance, then you're not be able to cycle over the fine line to the other side, but you actually collapse and you maladapt to training as well, something that we don't want to see. If we take it a step further and we look at the components of that, then training load is mainly defined by the intensity, the frequency, and the duration. So it's not super complex on that side to measure those, although it becomes a little bit more complex if you measure those components in a fatigue state rather than in a fresh state, because a fatigue state might be much more predictive of how well you do or don't do. Recovery is more complex because it's much more influenced by a lot of different components: sleep, social well-being, psychological well-being, stress levels that you have, nutritional intake. So finding the balancing and measuring that accurately is quite difficult from that perspective. If we look at performance in a very simplistic way, by training, we actually decrease our performance capacity. And then by applying a recovery component, we actually supercompensate. And if we do that well, we supercompensate a little bit more than a previous level. And that's how we slowly build our performance and improve our training status. So if you do that well each time around and you find the right balance between the two, we actually refer to that as effective training. If anything goes wrong in that system and you actually train too hard and your recovery is too slow, you're not compensating from your previous intensity or training, and that's where you're going to have a maladaptation to training. Or vice versa, if you train correctly but your recovery is just too low or too short, then you're not compensating as well, with the risk of ineffective training. Now, this is a typical part which is important for high performance sport, but it's also very important for people who start exercising the first time. If you get somebody who hasn't been active and you start exercising with them a lot right in the beginning and they cannot compensate, they actually get frustrated. People go to a gym, 3 weeks later, they haven't increased anything and they actually stop exercising because they don't see the benefit of it. So finding the balance between those two is important in a broad population, including high performance as well. Common parameters to monitor cyclists. Well, we got heart rate that's been around, but it's been evolved a lot over the years. So we had old heart rate monitors before, but nowadays we got heart rate monitors that can measure a lot of things at the same time. I think a lot of you might have a heart rate monitor and it tells you in the morning how your body battery is, of how well you slept or not slept and how those things go. So that's something that we can use and which actually becoming really useful in the setup where we work in. Because in the past, we would ask athletes to fill out, how well did you sleep? Can you please fill in? Oh, 7 hours. Wow, maybe it was 8. So the inaccuracy in that measurement is really difficult. Then, of course, we got something called power meters, something that, especially in cycling, is really useful because it allows us to actually measure power directly in the field and allows us also to look at data, which I'll come back a little bit later, what is happening throughout a race, because a race isn't one at the start, a race is one at the end of a performance component. And then we got our good old rating of perceived exertion. They can either run from 0 to 10 or from 6 to 20. And that also gives us information as well. And I think the trick here and the feedback that you get today is there's not one of those that will tell you the whole story. You need to combine different ones of those. Now, if we look at changes to training status, if nothing changes, everything stays the same. If you have an improved training status and we look at power at the same heart rate, let's say now we're cycling at 120 beats per minute, and I'm pushing out 150 watts. When my training status is better, I'm pushing out more power at the same heart rate. So still cycling at 120 now, I'm not pushing out 150 watts, but I'm pushing out 180 watts. So we see an increase in power at the same specific heart rate. If you flip that concept and you say, well, if I clamp power and I'm getting fitter, then my submaximal heart rate should come down. Okay. RPE at a specific intensity, it's easier, so it should come down. And heart rate recovery, which is an interesting parameter for us because it integrates the parasympathetic and the parasympathetic system, will normally be a lot faster. So I would always tell my students on my side, you're becoming a Ferrari. You can ref very quickly, you can drive very quickly, but you can recover very quickly as well. So that's an improved training status. What is the flip side of that? Well, actually, of course, the other way around. So power goes down at the same heart rate. Heart rate will be higher at the same intensity. RPE will be higher and heart rate recovery will be slower. This is not rocket science. This is just your basic principle of how we perceive how things are done if you improve or decrease your training status. And so if we look at training and the breakdown of training, we can actually first talk about a normal acute training component, which I just showed you in the graph. So we have an acute fatigue bout. Generally within a day, you supercompensate for that and you slowly increase that step. If you're really fit, go slower. If you're really unfit, those steps will be bigger. Then we got something what we refer to as functional overreaching. Now, this is something that we actually use in high performance sport relatively a lot, generally around training camps. We push people slightly into that fatigue component, and then we let them supercompensate a little bit more, and they can actually bounce back from that. Then we got a state what we call non-functional overreaching. Now, this is generally not something that we prefer to see, but the problem here is we've got weeks to months to recover from. Now, if you're an elite athlete, that's not going to help you. It's too long. You're too long off the field. Unless you're really good, you can stay within the team. If you're still at the build-up in the youth phase, that might mean you're not being selected for the team anymore, and therefore not make the cutoff to get into the first team or sign a contract, for instance, in cycling. And then if you keep on going, you'll develop a full-blown overtraining syndrome. Clearly not something that we want to look at. So if you want to look at monitoring athletes, you actually want to monitor them in that specific component, and maybe even more so know exactly when they are here. Are they targeted and you're actually picking up functional overreaching? And if so, is that your target? Yes, it's your target. If it's an unintended target, then you could still adapt the training load quite quickly. So you make sure that you correct for that maladaptation in quite early phase. So that brings the question, how then can we recognize that level of functional overreaching? What symptoms can we find from a practical perspective to see, okay, my athlete is not coping? Now, if we look at monitoring, we've got maximal performance tests, we've got sub-maximal performance tests, and we've got field data. I'm not going to talk too much about maximal performance tests because they generally are not really sensitive to actually pick that up. They pick up the phase where you're non-functional overreaching or have an overtraining syndrome. But it's not really helpful to do it on a regular basis. You also don't want to do a max test every week to make sure that are done. You can, of course, do it without gas analysis. There's all bunch of different components. You can do time trial tests as well, but they're generally also quite strenuous. So for monitoring purposes, these tests generally don't do really well and great from that perspective. They're valuable for cycling, and they give us a lot of information from a training perspective, from a monitoring perspective. They at least so far, they've shown very limited. Are there a few studies out there that looked at that? Yeah, there's a few studies. There's actually a study that the Nielsen group has performed, diagnosing overtraining in athletes. They specifically looked at athletes with a 2-bout exercise protocol, but they looked at athletes on the spectrum from, just go here, the overtraining, the non-functional overtraining status, and the group that had a full-blown overtraining syndrome. I think what's important for me here is that if you look at this data, which was collected and then followed up as well, is that the recovery period is extremely long. So recovery periods in that overtraining, the non-functional overtraining syndrome, were 1 to 6 months, which is clearly not ideal. Even worse so, 1 to 5 years. So unless you're Marianne Vos and you've got a track record and you did really, really well before winning different medals, it's unlikely that you survive this and still be with a professional cycling team. Is it possible to recover from it? Yes, it is possible. I think Marianne Vos is a clear example of that. But it's clearly something not where we want to be. So maximal performance test, in my opinion, not the most ideal test for monitoring purposes. Submaximal performance test in cycling. Well, you would think there should be a lot, but there's actually not a lot. There's actually, as far as I know, there's been 3 that we worked on. There's an Ostrom test, but it's mainly used for the prediction of VO2 max and peak power output. There's a physical work capacity test that is there, but it's also a predictive test as well. Then there are 2 other tests in the literature that I'm aware of. There's a Barbeau that did a bunch of testing. There's a group of Sassi that had 2 papers, and then I worked, which actually started more as a joke when we published this paper, on a submaximal test in cycling for monitoring purposes. And so if you look a little bit closer to that data, you can actually see that the Barbeau and the Sassi paper, they actually monitored other components. They monitored changes in heart rate and VO2 during a season, so not really on a regular basis. And then Sassi mainly looked at how they can predict time to exhaustion from lactic accumulation levels. And then so from there, we thought, okay, can we develop something that helps us to monitor athletes in a practical way, so not too actively involved or asking too much of an athlete, but still provides us with some guidance on how to do things and how to structure things. So let me just go to the next slide because it's going to take us a little bit easier. So within this specific test, we're asking cyclists to ride at a specific heart rate. So we determine maximal heart rate at the start of the season, and then we're asking them to cycle at 60%, at 80%, and at 90% of heart rate. And you can see here a little bit as well, it fluctuates a little bit at that 60%, but as you get to the higher intensities, you can actually ride on quite a stable heart rate throughout. And that don't give us an opportunity to collect a bunch of data. One of them is heart rate recovery. Advantage of this is that we can measure heart rate recovery each time exactly from the same submaximal heart rate. But we also can measure average power output during those stages as well. And so we're finding that relationship between heart rate and power output throughout the system as well. And then we're also asking them for RPEs, so we get a subjective scale as well. And then over the years, we've developed it with incorporating cadence, which gives us quite interesting feedback as well. You can look at the rate of increase of heart rate, which provides an info. We looked at RMSSD, what we currently are working on, and we worked on correction factors for environmental conditions that we actually did in collaboration with Hein in the past and Koen Labels. And so we get quite a test that at least, I wouldn't say to give us, our answer we're looking for, but it gives us guidance where to go and what to do. So heart rate recovery is interesting for us. Like I said, it incorporates a sympathetic and parasympathetic system, and which is influenced by a lot of different factors, both from physiological, from psychological components as well. So that helps us to analyze, like heart rate variability, how things are coping. The question, of course, that I want to talk a little bit about more today, can the LSCT and the data that we've got, can we actually detect functional overreaching when an athlete is functional overreaching, and what do we do? How do we see that, and what is responding in which specific way? So the first study that we did around this was with a cyclocross cyclist, which we followed over a 10-week period. And you can see he was pre-season. He built up from about 460 watts peak power output to 484. So we had a good increase throughout that system as well. And we looked at his data. What we saw is that we saw a nice gradual increase in power output. So this are the weeks on the x-axis. That's the power output in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and the first minute of stage 2. And you could see nice upward trends throughout that we want to see in line with the increase that we saw in power output as well. However, what we noticed as well, because you're working with an active athlete in the build-up for a season, is that he had 2 weeks of extreme high training loads. One was 233%, the other one was 160% of what his normal training load would be. And in cooperation with that, we saw interesting responses into the data that we had. So the first thing that we saw is that the power output at the specific heart rate actually went up. So he had to push out a lot more power to reach his target heart rate. Remember, we clamped the LSAT on a specific heart rate. So we saw increases in heart rate there, which was surprising because we didn't expect that to happen, but I'll get back to that just now. What we also saw is that heart rate recovery was suddenly a lot faster. Also something that we didn't expect to happen. And what we did see here is that RPE was increased. Okay, that makes sense. He's tired. He did more work. So when you're doing the test, he feels it's a lot harder. That makes sense to me, but the other two doesn't make sense. And so the other thing that we did as well is we looked at the delta score, which has been a good indicator of fatigue and functional overreaching. And in that data, we actually saw that he had an increase in A scores, which is a simpler version of the POMS, I would almost say, to show that he was actually in a what we call functional overreaching status as well. So we then look at our schematic that we've got, is that we noticed that some of the things didn't make sense, because if he was overloaded in his training status would have been decreased, he would have had higher RPEs, something that we did see, but we actually saw higher power output, where we maybe would have expected lower power output because he was fatigued. And we also saw a faster heart rate recovery and not a slower heart rate. So we didn't know exactly what was going on here. It was what I would refer to as a counterintuitive response. You would think it would flip the one way, but it actually flipped the other way. And so then from there, we thought, well, maybe this is coincidence, maybe it's a specific case. We don't know how, what, and where. And I bumped into Romain Merson at one of the conferences of ECSS, and I met Lieselotte Ducroix, who was a professional cyclist at Lotto Soudal. I think she was with Lotto Jumbo. She's just moving now again to FDJ. And she said, well, why don't we do a study on my side? I'll collect the data and you can help me analyze the data. And so what we did with that study is we had a group of female cyclists that did a training camp, 8-day training camp, and we did a bunch of testing. We did LCT, POMS, and fatigue scales before. We did it at day 5, day 8, and then day 11 as well. This is what we call a flush out period. So this is the extra recovery period that they got to recover from their training camp. And then we looked at the data. So we then looked at changes in RPE over time. We saw a similar response. Throughout, during the LSCT, RPEs went up by day 5 compared to day 8 and day 8 as well. So that's exactly what we saw in the other study as well. And then we look at power. we saw a similar tendency as well. We saw power going up significantly. And remember, these are female athletes that are trained reasonably well already. And you see here is that at stage 2, we see increases in power of 8.2 and even later on 14 or 15%. Now, these are not normal physiological responses. These are big increases in power that you wouldn't expect normally as part of a response to an 8-day training camp. There are ways of maybe achieving this, but it might not be the way that you want to achieve those things. And so that's not a normal physiological response. Heart rate recovery, also a lot faster, day 5. We also encountered problems when they got to day 8 because they struggled to get the heart rate up. And then we started playing around and said, okay, what is happening here? So there's different physiological mechanisms. One of them is an increased parasympathetic activity regulation that prevents the heart rate of going up. So when you're really fatigued, what you're getting is your heart rate is not naturally responding. You can get it up. And so what you then have to do in the test that we designed is you have to push it so much extra power to still be able to achieve that. What is probably explaining massive increases in power that we saw in this study as well. So we're definitely a counterintuitive response again, and very confusing as well, because if you wouldn't have RPE and you would just look at the rest of the data and you would say your athlete at the same heart rate is pushing out significantly more power and the heart rate recovery is significantly faster, then a lot of coaches will say, oh, well, fantastic. Let's keep on continuing or do a little bit more, with the risk of pushing that athlete from that functional overreaching status into a non-functional overreaching status. Then we thought, okay, let's flip the whole coin idea. We've got an ultra marathon as well in Cape Town. Why don't we try it on runners and see what's happening there? So in this study, we've recruited a whole bunch of athletes. They did a 56K ultra marathon. That's the marathon mark there. So when you're at the marathon, you're clearly not there yet because you clearly can see there's a little hump still to go at the end. It's a hard race. And then we developed a set maximal running test based on the LSAT, but running on heart rate is a little bit difficult unless you're going to be running like this all the time, which is going to be tricky. So we flipped the concept and we actually clamped it on power, on peak treadmill running speed. So we did 55, 70, and 85, and we did it before, and then 2 days after the marathon as well, we got them into the lab and we did a whole bunch of testing on them. We collected data again, including the delta and the DOMs. And again, as expected, in line with the other things, we saw an increase in RP a little bit. We saw it in a lesser extent at stage 2, but we saw a similar tendency in heart rate. Because what's happening here now, if you flip the concept, you would think if somebody's tired, his heart rate would actually go up. We actually saw that in most of them, the heart rate would actually slowly come down. So at the same running speed now, while they were fatigued, the heart rate is not higher, but the heart rate is lower. So in line with the other papers, actually, we found a similar response. So I think what we're picking up here is, okay, that's higher, that's what we expected, that's lower, that's not what we expected. And that one was faster, it was also not expected as well. So I think the take-home message here is it's very tricky to find the markers of functional overreaching. And you really need to look at different components together. So if you see these responses, you see an abnormal change, an unphysiological change in a certain parameter, that is basically should ring alarm bells on your side and think, okay, something must be going on here. And RPE clearly plays an important role in to differentiate on those different components as well. So captivating that, RPE is differentiating very clearly. It responds in an opposite way, but be aware that power at heart rate or heart rate at the same power output, if you would turn it the other way, and heart rate recovery respond identically as an improved training centers. So they might not, as standalone, they might be not reliable to monitor your athlete. So you need to add on different components to it as well. Quite recently with Annemiek Rutte, who works now for DSM, we did a systematic review on markers for functional overreaching. I haven't covered everything, and there's different papers out there as well. So if you want to know a little bit more about this specific field, it might be quite a nice paper to have a look at and have a feel of where we're at this point in time. Okay, let's take a little bit of a step. Now, we've talked a little bit about monitoring in the field, in labs, in very well-controlled conditions, generally in relatively rested state components. Let's talk a little bit about moving things from out of the lab into the field. And like I said before, nowadays we're getting lots of information from power meters, from heart rate monitors that we can work with. And it allows us to have, over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, a very unique insight into what are the demands in cycling and what's happening on that side. A lot of things have changed in cycling. These are the old bikes, so you would carry your spare tubes around your shoulders, no gears, and you would bring your own pump. Clearly, we've developed a little bit in that aspect now because we've got a whole range of different things. We've got power meters, we've got specialized warm-ups. We can control and know exactly everything what was going on. And if you follow the cycling a little bit, nowadays you can get insights through cameras what's happening in the field, not to talk about the TU Delft doing all the aerodynamics from that perspective as well. So a lot of things have changed and allowed us to really look about what's happening during those races as well. Advantages of field data is you can really see what's happening actually in the field when it really matters. But the other problem is we're getting a lot of side noise of interpreting the data. What is the effect of the peloton? What is the temperature? Are there tactics playing? So also, again, it's not the golden key to understanding everything, but it definitely helps you to understand a piece of the puzzle again. So power meters I talked about, and within cycling and cycling performance, we a lot look at what we call the power profile. And within the power profile, we talk about mean maximal power outputs. It's a mean maximal power output over a certain specific duration. And we can calculate this over what I would call shorter periods, which is 5 or 10 seconds up to about maybe 3 minutes or so. And we get longer durations as well. And if you can combine them, we get basically a power profile to see where you're really good at. That provides us insight into what type of cyclist are you? Are you really good in the short intervals and you're more a sprinter? Or are you slightly better in the long duration, which we generally see with climbers as well? And so from that, it also allows us to see, okay, can we monitor that then? And with that, do we see an increase or a decrease in that power profile over the season or over the years if it's youngsters that you work with? So that provides us with a lot of insight. And then we, of course, are really interested in what's happening throughout the season as well, but also what's happening throughout a race. And within that, the recent developments in cycling, but I think in a lot of endurance sport, is related to something we refer to as physiological resilience, durability, fatigue resistance. So what's happening here is we're trying to get insight into not the outputs and the peak power outputs at the moment that they're starting a race or when you see them in the lab, but what is actually happening throughout a race. And how well or not well are they at the end of the race when it's being determined who's going to win the stage or not the stage? So as part of that, quite recently, Andrew Jones wrote an article about it. He even goes as far as calling it the fourth dimension of endurance sports. And he had quite a nice graph, I think. So it's not about how you start here, but it's how much is left in that battery when you're actually at the finish. So how much is the decrease in performance over that time frame? So when you start your marathon here, and this is the finish, this athlete might be evenly good at the start, but he drops 15% of his capacity, where the other one only drops 5% of capacity, which means that at the end of the race, he can make the difference of winning that race as well. Now, we transfer that idea, so you don't want to finish like that just before the finish line, but yet you want to finish like that just after the finish line. You can be exhausted, but that's fine. That's as long as it's after the finish line. Okay, so based on that concept, we worked with Teun van Herp, who actually got his PhD here about 5 years ago, I think before, and has been embedded working with Team DSM for years. He's been at Ineos. He just started a new job with a new team called Tudor in Switzerland. And so we really interested, okay, what's happening with fatigue in that MMPs, but how do you define fatigue? Because that's really difficult to do. So what we did is, okay, let's work out the kilojoules burned, and based on that, see what's happening over time. And so we looked at completed kilojoules work done, and then based on that, at that point in time, we worked back, okay, what's happening to those power outputs over time. And within that study of time, we actually had a group of cyclists, really, professional cyclists, sprinters. We had 15, and we had climbers, so we split up the groups. And then we had data, nearly 18,000 power files between 2011 and 2019. And we looked at that data. And then within that group, we also split them up into what we call highly successful athletes who actually would score points, pro cycling stats points above 400, and then ones who were good but didn't score that many points at the end as well. And then we looked at different power outputs. So what you then get is you get, and I've selected 4 here. This is a 10-second MMP, 1-minute MMP, 5-minute MMP, 20-minute MMP in climbers and in sprinters, and then build up over time with the amount of kilojoules burned. So let's have a closer look first at the climbers. And if you look at climbers over time, what you actually see here is this is 0 kilojoules burn, and this is going over the edge, over the line there. When they get to 50 kilojoules burn, you see there's a decrease in performance, as you would expect. They get fatigued, so the outputs over the short time frames are getting less. But there's no significant difference between the highly successful climbers, which are here shown in green, and the less successful, still very successful, but less scoring points cyclists in that component. However, if you look at the 20-minute MMP data, which makes sense because for a climber, a 20-minute effort is much more important than, for instance, a 10-second MMP. You see significant differences. And you see that the deterioration in power over time actually develops totally different than the other group. So on average, in the highly successful climbers, we saw over average 4% decrease, where the other still professional cyclists decreased by 9%. And so there's no differences there. We saw that these were significant differences when they reach 50 kilojoules per kilogram, so roughly by the end of a stage. So here you really can see that there is a difference. Some of these top climbers barely had, this was the first time that they really start showing any drop in the MMP data. So up to 40 kilojoules, if you now talk about individual data, you see that they were roughly the same. And the first time they started dropping off is here. Now, there's a lot of factors that are playing potentially a role in this because cycling is not an individual sport, it's a team sport as well. And we partly compensated for that because we calculated kilojoules per kilogram. But we need to admit that potentially risk or tactics around with regards to making sure your top rider doesn't have to do a lot might have influenced the outcome slightly. If we then look at sprinters, we actually see totally the flip side. So for them, that 20-minute is not really important. But we do see massive differences in the sprinter capacity, so the 10-second capacity, which they really need to have to win that sprint. And so again, big differences, 8.6 against 17.1. And at the end of a race, that really makes the difference being able to win or not win the data. Do we see that in cyclists as well? Yes, we looked at cyclists. We looked at it slightly different. So we had here 14 cyclists, again, over a longer period of time, quite a bit of power files, not as many as the males, because female cycling wasn't as popular at those years. It's becoming very popular at the moment, which is great to see. But we looked at the timing of MMP. So when did these cyclists hit the highest MMP value? And then here we see a similar tendency as well. So your top riders, they achieve their peak power outputs much later in the race than the other ones. Again, so this is partly tactics, or an achievement is in the race. It's in times and minutes. And if you look at kilojoules spent, so we're partly now correcting again for kilojoules spent as well, then we see a similar tendency as well. In almost in all the different components as well. So looking at decrement in performance over time, especially in endurance sports, if it's running or other components, is a very promising new tool to look at and can probably predict performance as well. So the questions that we don't know is how can we monitor? Is it able to monitor those fatigue resistance? Is it trainable? And to what extent is that trainable? Is it genetic? Can it assist people within a cycling team identifying who should be their top person for a specific race and who should rather be the helper in the setup of part of the team, the domestic? And can it potentially help in talent development? So very early on in the race, can you already see who naturally has an aspect for that and can potentially do really well in certain races? Because a preparation for a Grand Tour is totally different than a preparation for a one-day race. Data, like I said, can be influenced by team tactics. Data can be influenced by the race of the stage. Environmental conditions, again, I don't think we've got the golden answer to it, but it definitely gives you some ideas of where we are and where we're at. Where are we for time?
Time was 35 minutes.
35 minutes. That's good news.
So
we got a little bit, got 10 minutes left. Oh, we got 20 minutes left. That's good. So we talked a little bit about monitoring in the lab. We talked a little bit about field data and what's the recent developments in that area. And there might be ideas that you pick up from this that you can use within your own research or things that you want to start or specifically look into. Another part where I want to briefly introduce you to, and this is really new data that haven't been published yet, is a paper that we've done together with Annemiek van Vleuten and Tom Dumoulin. We don't have to hide them anymore because they're actually co-authors on the paper as well. And we were very fortunate to get that data. So we got that data of the Giro Donau, the Giro Rosa. I think that's race is almost changing its name almost every year. And we've got Annemiek's data from 2018 and 2019 when she won it. And then we've got Tom's data from 2017 and 2018 when he one time won it and the second time became second. So all question was, these are two totally different individuals with different characteristics in different races, but are there still similarities or not when we look at that data, yes or no? So are they really different? Yes, there are different. We've got a 10-day race there with no resting days. We've got a 20-day race there with resting days. Distances are totally different. Here, the average distance is 94 kilometers. It's 170 around on that side. So there's a lot of differences between the two, and it's clearly not really comparable against each other. Then, of course, we've got differences in the power profile between Annemiek in pink and between Tom on the other side, and we put them next to each other. This is data that actually directly comes out of the both Giros. And again, this is partly influenced by the tactics throughout a race, but it's quite interesting to notice here is that those differences exist in that specific part there, but as you go longer, those differences tend to come down a little bit. So there's a difference about 2.3 watts per kilogram at that 5-second mark, but if you look at the back here at about a 2-hour ride, it's only about 0.4 watts per kilogram. Now, that's still relatively big, but it's actually a lot closer than we initially expected it to be. Are these then exceptionally high? Not really. Well, not really in that perspective. If we compare it to data from, this was Valenzuela, I think, who looked at it might be Mateo March as well, looked at the peak power output, the record ones that ever been recorded in cycling. You can see not always she's performing optimally. You might not expect her to perform optimally here as well, but remember this data on this side were mainly the sprinters, and Annemiek van Vleuten is not a sprinter. She's a time trial specialist and a climber. But you can see here she's very close to those record marks. So she got a really extremely high capacity to perform really well in those longer durations. So if you talk about a climb, last climb 20 minutes, if you talk about a time trial with Jenny Hoffers between 20 and 60 minutes, you can see she's really competitive in that field. Same story if you look at the data of Tom. Tom's got good values as well, not always super high. But again, it tells you the story. It's not only power that determines if you're successful or not successful in cycling. It's the team that stands around it as well. It's cycling smart and knowing exactly what to do and when you need to do what. What we do see is that both of them are really well in the longer duration components, which coincides with the fact that they specialize in the time trial component and the climbing component. How to then compare a male and a female rider? Well, what we try to do is then almost work out a relative percentage of power. So we actually worked out what we call their FTP, the functional threshold power. And then based on that, we calculated the percentage that they were riding at functional threshold power. And then you can also use that as well to make power distribution zones and how much time they spend in what component as well. So if we look at a time trial, and you can see the energy distribution is quite similar to both people, to both Annemiek and Tom. We also see that if you look at their FTP performance, they're riding at about 100% of FTP, which makes sense because functional threshold power is generally the power that is associated with riding very closely when you're doing a specific time trial. And interestingly enough, they're within 1 to 2% from each other. So it's very close. So you got a male and a female, it's two totally different races, but if you look at the time for performance, they're really, really close. If we look at flat stages, this is interesting. Now we're seeing a massive difference there, especially in the first 50% of those races. The intensity of the female riders is significantly higher than we see in the males. But as soon as we get into the last part again, it gets really close. 0.8 there and 3% there. But the interesting part, of course, is what's happening here. And I think one of the things that's happening in female cycling is that because the stages are a lot shorter, the first half becomes really tactful. So you cannot let a small group get away in a flat stage in female cycling because you're not going to catch them again. Where with male cycling, we see the opposite. The first part, they basically just wander around. Well, not wandering around, but they're taking it very easy. They can let a group get away. The group is generally bigger as well. The peloton is bigger, so it's much easier to get them back. Now, one way of preventing somebody to escape to get a breakaway from the team is making sure that the pace is really high. And I think that's one of the tactics that we're seeing here as well at the front. So the tactics in that aspect is totally different. You look at one of the papers of Tony, he looked at training intensity in male and female cyclists, and Dario Sanders looked at the racing page, and you see that there is different training aspect of that as well, which makes sense because you want to train on what is needed for your component. So you see that those females generally tend to train much more in zone 4 or 5 for these type of races than what you would see in males. Semi-mountain stages, well, interesting, very similar, very close to each other. Females starting off a little bit, but again, the last bar 0.9 to 1.5%. Are they pushing out the same power? No. Are they pushing out the same percentage of FTP? Yes, they do. And then mountain stage is the same story as well. We're seeing a small, significant difference towards the end of a race that might have to do with the duration, where Annemiek is able to run a slightly higher percentage of her FTP than Tom could. You can also argue maybe Annemiek is overall a slightly better climber than Tom was in his good days. I think Tom was a little bit more a time trial specialist than he was a good climber, but maybe a slightly other balance than those other two as well. Okay, then we're getting towards the end of the story. Let's bring it back again then. Okay, what's happening to fatigue? And back to the field data, what we see. Well, what we see here with Annemiek is that she's being able to maintain. She finishes generally around 40 kilojoules in the longer stages, around 40 kilojoules per kilogram. And you can see she can stay up to almost no decrease or no decrease at all, up to about 30 kilojoules per kilogram. So she's very smart in making sure she's protecting her power output and only start using it at the really last component of it. And then she's losing a relatively lot, of course, in that 10-second part, but in that 20-second part, she's only losing about 6.2%. Do we see the same story with Tom? Yes, we see the same story with Tom. Slightly further, of course, which makes sense because the stages are significantly longer. We talked about this before. The one was about 90, the other one about 170. There's a clear difference there as well. But again, with him as well, very unique in this setup. And if you compare it to the literature data that's currently available out there, it's really exceptional that they're able to maintain almost no drop in their MMP value data and only starting to drop in a very late stage. So again, this seems to be a very critical role and in support of what the current literature is focusing on, a very important marker for endurance performance, endurance athletes to look at that. I think it also opens up a potential way of monitoring that and seeing how can we monitor this? How do we monitor this in the field? Can you use tactics of that in the field as well? And in which way we can, use it to our benefit. I think in the time of scheme and where we are and being able to sort out and make sure we've got a few questions, we'll leave it there. And like I said, there's quite a lot of questions still remaining, but it's a very exciting field currently we're in. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this interesting presentation. It's time for questions, both here in the room and also people at home. Who can I give the floor for the first question? Yes, Richie.
Thanks for the talk. Really nice. So you spoke about these counterintuitive responses when athletes were functionally overreaching.
Yeah.
I think I missed the physiological explanation for that. How do you explain that?
So there's different components that we look at. I think they don't really have a good answer to it at this moment. The one thing that we definitely see in a overreaching state, is stand here a little bit because then the online people can hear as well, is that we get a really increased parasympathetic regulation at the moment that somebody's fatigued. So you see a really down regulation of the sympathetic component and an increased sympathetic component as well. Catecholamines play potentially an important role in that as well, the release of those, and the beta-2 blockers on the heart might also be less sensitive to responses in that. So you see a much slower response in that heart rate. One of the biggest challenges we have with the LSCT is at that third component, a lot of the cyclists are going to struggle to get the heart rate up to 90%, which makes it sometimes practically difficult to implement the test on that side. On the other side, you can also argue, well, on itself, not reaching that might be useful as well. But we're playing around if we can change or adapt it slightly so we don't have to push them fully up to the 90%. We're pushing them up to the 90% because we know that the variability in heart rate recovery, when you measure it from 90%, is the lowest. If the variability is the lowest, you've got the highest sensitivity to pick up changes in abnormal, out of normal range adaptation or responses to heart rate recovery.
Hey, Jos.
Because heart rate is not reliable, if I because of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic influences. But your feel could be quite reliable.
Well, clearly,
we say that we often think that it's a subjective feeling. But could you design an LSCT not based on heart rate, but based on the RPE?
You could. No, absolutely.
So,
I think
just ask the athlete, right?
Yeah. No, I think there's different ways. Yeah.
And then look what he powered up with.
Yeah. But so what we see with
because in the morning when I walk the stairs up and down, I already know what kind of day it will be.
Very, yeah. Well, that's true. If you talk to Luis de la Haye, who was worked with Rabobank in the past and later on with the triathletes, he said it was just my biggest part of being an athlete and making sure they're fine is in the morning. So when we're in the hotel with the team, I would walk down. I'll make sure I'm half an hour there before everybody else walks in, and then I just sit there on my chair and I just wait for them to walk in. And when they walk in, I can already tell, oh, no, he's having not a good day. And so I think there's a lot of that. You're doing really right. I think whatever protocol you develop, because you can clamp it on power. People have clamped it on power. UAE is clamping it on percentage of FTP. You can clamp it on RP. I think whatever format you take will have pros and cons. But I think the concept of doing a submaximal standardized test and seeing how the responses to that are might be a useful tool to monitor, at least partly in a objective way. But if you correctly say so, RPE is the important part here that shows you if they're responding well and if there's a counterintuitive response. So it's multiple components that you need to look at. I absolutely right.
Because of the data in an 8-day event, the readiness to train value also.
Yeah.
At the third day, at least, I guess, predicts 83% of the variation you see at the end.
Yeah, that's true.
Power up.
Yeah. No, I think it's trying to search for what we can do within the limits. You've got cardiac drift, which clearly influences performance as well. But on the other side, that could be a similar argument around power as well. It might decrease over time, which we see now. So again, I don't think unfortunately, there's not one golden bullet that we can find that explains the whole story.
Okay.
But yeah.
Thank you. To follow up on this question, very nice presentation too. So one of the papers you described was the scope of the global training study with Muse.
Yes.
Where they tested that actually, we looked it up, the ACTH and prolactin measures.
Yeah. But when did they find the differences?
Sorry?
When they can read when they found the differences?
They're only the second test.
Yeah, and in rest.
And rest.
Yeah.
But that's where I'm going towards, like part of the physical mechanism. Do you think that I mean, RPE maybe one, but it's not maybe subjective. It's giving a hint to a physical or no what's happening in the body. Do you know any biomarkers and blood markers that can predict overreaching, overtraining, or when it goes over the water, over the edge of going in the wrong direction?
But can you repeat the questions for the people?
Yeah, so the question from the audience here is are you aware of any biomarker, correct me if I'm wrong, that can predict the state of functional overreaching? The answer to is not that I'm aware of. I know that the group from Tom Meyer in Saarbrücken do quite a bit of work on that. They looked at different components. They looked at it in a very practical way, taking it from saliva at cortisol levels and stuff. But this also, again, it's not conclusive. I think as well, how I see what I present here is it's not the golden bullet to say, okay, somebody's functioning overreach, but it should help a coach in an aspect. Something is not right here.
Of course, it'd be much nicer if you can have just a finger break.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, will put us out of a job though, because then we're done with exercise. But again, it's a good question, and it would be great even if it's only partially explaining it to add it to the piece of the puzzle. It might be impossible to say, okay, let's take during any submaximal test a blood sample as well, especially in high performance cycling. That might be a bit tricky because they will not open. They will, that they're going to clamp that down very quickly. But on the other side, if you can motivate that, that's a fair way of looking at it. And, you can say, we've seen certain markers now. We want to double check if there is need something going on. It's a very good idea.
Can I ask a follow-up question first from there? Because you used to quantify fatigue, you used kilojoules spent.
Yes.
And my idea is that if sometimes I spend the same amount of kilojoules, but I feel fatigued, and sometimes I do not feel fatigued. So my question is there any link that you could make between kilojoules spent and RPE? Is that a clear link?
Don't know. Well, I would think so, but especially when it's accumulative over a longer period of time. But you're making a fair point. It depends on if you're going to accumulate this when you all cycled in zone 1, or if you're all cycling in zone 4 or 5. So clearly, you're burning more calories at higher intensities quicker.
Yeah.
But clearly, that plays a role. I think that makes it difficult as well because, and maybe I'm very conservative because, I always say, listen, maybe I'm very skeptical of using fatigue very quickly because what is fatigue? And B is how do you quantify fatigue? So I think what we try to do here, and we just had a discussion with one of our PhD students as well, is like, well, if you want to use the fatigue term, which a lot of other papers have done, and they've gone through and they've published it, which from a general public perspective is great because that's what people want to hear. It sells well, but it's really tricky because it's very difficult to back it up. So I think what we tried to do is we did kilojoules per kilogram. There's other papers that only looked at pure kilojoules because then you can argue again, well, if you're looking at weight, how does that contribute? Yes or no? I don't think again it's dissolution to it, but I think it's the closest that we could come up with at that point in time to as much as possible to correct for it.
It's difficult. We were asked to do research about fatigue in soldiers. And I said, okay, what's fatigue? And they said, leave it up to us. We'll make sure that they will get fatigued. And we exactly know how fatigued they are. So I wonder if that's the case. We're going to test it and what they come up with.
Yeah. Let me know when they got the golden answer to that.
There's another question from Richie, yes?
Yeah. Similar to the first one, but it's about the concept of durability.
Yeah.
So I'm interested by that because you read that recent review from Andy Jones. The claim is that with all the traditional determinants of endurance performance, so 2 athletes with the same VO2 max, critical power, and efficiency, they will differ in their durability, which implies they have the durability itself has a different underpinning physiology. So, do you have any ideas about what durability consists of? What is it?
Good question. I think if we knew that, then we would be a lot closer.
Do you have ideas?
Well, so the question is, what determines it? Is it a genetic factor? Is it trainable? If we look at training load, for instance, from 1 week, but now we're going very much off the scientific components, but much more from a practical perspective. We know the training load was about double, at least up to last season, than most of the other girls. And so you could argue, did that potentially explain why she could do really well in races like the Giro? Is there basis for critical power? Absolutely. No, I absolutely feel so. I do feel that traditionally in performance sport, we tend to fall a lot back on what I call maximal performance. So we determine peak power output as a predictor of something, or VO2 max or something. And yes, they need to be high, but you can argue, should we not rather look at how efficient people are at a certain sub-maximal level where most of the races are being performed at?
The paper had that, the classic joiner model.
Yeah.
Which I think tries to incorporate those aspects as well.
Yeah.
But how you digest your food you take during the hour is not in the model.
Yeah.
I think a large part will be how you deal with what you eat.
Especially for Tom.
Yeah. If you cycle for a couple of hours, then you need to eat.
What glycogen storage? That's stored in the muscle.
Actually, in one of the papers that we based this idea on, they did glucose feeding during 1 to 2 hour ride, and they stopped the decadent critical power. So, yeah, maybe that's maybe.
That's the problem. It's so incredibly complex. It would be interesting to see what's happening to critical power throughout a longer race, and if that differs within highly successful and less successful people.
I saw another question popping up from Yannick in the back of the room.
Yeah, I was wondering why doesn't the difference need to be physiological? I think the psychological explanation is much more simple.
He's a psychologist, by the way.
Well, he makes a very fair point.
Perfect.
No, well, I think clearly the fact that RPE plays a role in this tells you a story that it cannot be purely physiological. I think there's multiple components, and psychological is definitely one of them. And I think at this level, maybe a really big one as well, because a lot of these cyclists are very similar. And I think if you look at a lot of the high performance sport, the capacities are so close together that it might be that the physiological or the psychological component plays a tremendous role in that last bit and pieces where you're either going to say, I'm going to make it or not make it. But
Can I comment? Everyone wants to win, right? And so what's the physiological difference again?
Psychological, yeah. It's about your strategy for pacing. It's also if you fall back, how do you deal with someone is, for example, has a different pacing strategy, but you're behind. It's a completely different mental state than leading, for example. So
if it's
minor changes within the race, how we prepare for the race, see how stressed you were, do you want to win, do you not want to lose?
But for me, the fact that it's psychological is clearly seen when we look at the Olympics. Let's take 100 meter. And at the end of the 100 meter, number 2 to 8, falling on the floor, totally collapsed. The number 1 picks up a flag and runs another lap. So clearly there must be a psychological component that plays an important role in that as well. So I don't believe in models that truly psychological or physiological.
Talk about Ajax, eh?
That's true. That's true. Now I know where I am.
I don't find it fair.
Okay, I think
All right.
I don't see any fingers anymore. Oh, there's another finger. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
The subject rate there, they use RPE, but there's also another indicator, the PPI, exercise induced pain, and how to make sure the subject practically rate their fatigue rather than their muscle pain.
Can you repeat the question? So there's exercise-induced pain
Yes.
and RPE.
Yes.
So what is the relation between the two, and why not taking exercise-induced pain as a variable?
It's a good question. I don't know. We haven't specifically looked at that. So there's multiple components. I think the one that I worked on is task effort awareness, the TEA, which is more a psychological component. How much aware of you that you need to push yourself. I think there's different parameters out there that are being used. I haven't worked with the one you're referring to, but again, there's only one way to find
I
out.
looked into that. And exercise-induced pain stops suddenly. It stops when you finish time, or maybe it's for 30 seconds over there, your perceived exertion is still there. And that was the reason why we used perceived exertion, because perceived exertion you also can you still have the feel of perceived exertion after the race, while your exercise-induced pain, that's difficult. So I think that as a measure.
Must be really old because I have exercise and use brain every time I exercise.
There's one question online from Jo de Heuvel. Jo, can you ask your
Yeah, okay. Robert, thank you for an excellent presentation. Can you hear me? I put it in the chat also, the question. I don't hear you because Hein is on mute.
Yes, but I can hear you.
Okay. So I said, thanks for an excellent presentation. You mentioned the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. What is your opinion about using heart rate variability in sports?
Okay, that's a good
Because it's
question. So I'll go back and I'll repeat your question and I'll try to answer it. Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, so Yo asked me, one of the other popular tools that are being used in high performance sport and partially in cycling as well as heart rate variability. What are your experiences and what are your ideas around this? Now, it's tricky because that field is developing so rapidly, and heart rate variability can be looked at in different components. You can look at it at a time perspective, a domain perspective, and an interaction perspective as well. I think the time perspective, especially the RMSSD, has shown the biggest potential to monitor and look at changes in heart rate variability and in cycling. We're actually busy, hopefully getting a publication on that in EJET quite soon. From the bigger systematic review that we did with Groningen, with Annemiek, we saw that at least the data that was available up to that point, that heart rate variability itself was not able to indicate a training or a status of functional overreaching. So what is the big story behind, for instance, heart rate recovery and heart rate variability? As far as we've seen in most literature have shown so far, heart rate variability is quite sensitive to be able to reflect big changes in load and fluctuation through that. Where the heart rate variability part seems to be much more a slower neuromodulation of the system. So it does change over time, but the question is how sensitive is it to actually be able to respond to very quick changes in response as well. So is there a place for heart rate variability? Yes, I think so, but much more in a longer duration path component than actually in a very acute component, as far as I've been able to see the scientific data on that.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question a little bit, Joe.
One brief question there, the last one.
Yeah, I was wondering, so is fatigue after fatigue you see a decrement in performance? Does it matter how this fatigue is achieved? So, for example, if the intensity is very high and the duration is low, do you see a different decrement in performance than a low intensity with a long duration?
Good question. I think it relates a little bit to what Hein was talking about before. If you building everything up, the kilojoules when you're riding in zone 1, 2, or if you're riding in 4 or 5. To be honest, I don't know. I think the studies, what we've done so far, have, of course, been done on retrospective data in field conditions, where I think a lot of the components play a role, team tactics, a whole bunch of things. Would almost be very interesting in the next steps to go forward now is, okay, what's actually happening to that if we do it on a simulated indoor trainer over a specific period of time and see, without those trying to almost take those environmental components away and those interaction components of other team members, do we see a similar decrease in performance as well, yes or no? So I think we literally just started to open up this field, and there's still a lot of unknowns in that specific area as well.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. Also, thank you for all your online. Thank you.